January 1943. Over the icy skies of northern Germany, a formation of American B-17 bombers drifts through thin white clouds, engines groaning, vapor trails cutting the sky like scars. In the tail turret of one bomber, Sergeant William H. Carter grips the twin .50 caliber Brownings. His breath fogs the glass as the call comes through the intercom. "Fighters! 6 o'clock high!" Black dots appear on the horizon, growing larger by the second. Messerschmitts diving from the sun. Carter tracks one perfectly in his sight, squeezes the trigger, and watches every tracer streak harmlessly ahead of the target. The German fighter slips past untouched, guns blazing. He fires again, same result. The bomber jolts violently. Somewhere above, another B-17 blossoms into flame. For months, U.S. gunners had followed their training. Aim directly at the target, lead slightly, fire in bursts. Yet the Luftwaffe kept cutting through formations with deadly precision. Then, one strange idea began to circulate through the air crews, a rule that defied every instinct they'd been taught. To hit the enemy, you had to aim behind him, and that discovery would soon double America's kill rate and change aerial warfare forever. By the beginning of 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces were fighting a war they had never truly trained for. The doctrine of daylight precision bombing, once a bold theory, was now a daily gamble with death. From airfields in England, hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators rose each morning, their silver bodies glinting in the dawn, heading for the heart of Nazi Germany. Their mission was simple on paper: destroy factories, oil refineries, and rail networks to cripple the German war machine. But every man in those formations knew the truth. Getting to the target and coming home alive were two very different things. German air defenses were among the deadliest in the world. Flak batteries ringed every major city, spewing black bursts of shrapnel into the air. Above them, waves of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s waited for the bomber's streams. They attacked in perfect coordination, from high and head-on, from low and behind, slicing through the sky like predators among cattle. For the gunners aboard American bombers, it was a nightmare of sound and motion. Each aircraft carried up to 10 men and 10 guns, meant to create a shield of lead against attacking fighters. But reality was cruel. Despite thousands of rounds fired in each mission, Luftwaffe pilots often escaped unscathed. U.S. kill ratios were disastrously low. Crews returned shaken, sometimes missing half their formation. In the first half of 1943, loss rates reached levels that bordered on unsustainable. The mission to Schweinfurt in August saw 60 of 376 bombers fail to return. That meant more than 600 men lost in a single day, and the survivors reported the same frustration. They saw their tracers. They aimed correctly. Yet the enemy fighters slipped through untouched. The official manuals had instructed gunners to lead the target, aim slightly ahead, to account for the fighter's motion. It made sense in theory. Yet in the air, at 25,000 feet and 300 miles per hour, theory broke down. Bullets that seemed perfectly aimed would always pass in front of the enemy plane. At first, commanders blamed nerves, poor eyesight, or lack of discipline. But the pattern was too consistent. Gunners weren't missing by chance. They were missing the same way every time. Something deeper was wrong. Instructors at Eglin Field in Florida began to suspect the problem wasn't the men. It was the physics. The training films used for gunnery practice had been based on World War I scenarios, where both aircraft moved relatively slowly. But at modern speeds, perspective and motion played tricks on the eye. The enemy wasn't where he appeared to be. That simple realization would become the first crack in an old doctrine, one that would soon be shattered. completely by science, mathematics, and the strange truth of aerial combat geometry. The deeper the instructors studied the problem, the clearer it became. U.S. gunnery doctrine was built on illusions. At Eglin Field and the Las Vegas Army Gunnery School, teams of physicists, mathematicians, and combat veterans began re-examining every step of the firing process, from how bullets left the barrel to where they struck the sky seconds later. Their findings were startling. When a bomber and an enemy fighter both moved at hundreds of miles per hour, the relationship between their flight paths created what scientists called a deflection error. The human eye, watching through a moving turret at a diving target, misjudged the fighter's real position by several degrees. The faster the closing speed, the larger the optical lag. In other words, when a gunner thought he was firing at the fighter, he was actually aiming too far ahead. By the time his bullets reached that point in space, the German plane had already passed behind it. Film analysis confirmed it. Training cameras mounted beside gun barrels recorded every burst. When slowed down frame by frame, instructors saw tracers streak harmlessly past the noses of enemy aircraft. The gunners weren't poor shots. They were victims of physics. That's when the radical idea emerged. A group led by Dr. Lee DeForest's wartime research team, working with the Army Air Force's Proving Ground, proposed a counterintuitive correction. Aim behind the target. At first, it sounded absurd. Every instinct in a gunner's body said otherwise. You're chasing a moving enemy. How could shooting behind him make sense? But the math didn't lie. The fighter's high closing speed meant that from the gunner's perspective, the point where he saw the enemy was already outdated by the time he pulled the trigger. So, by deliberately aiming slightly behind, at where the fighter was, not where he appeared to be, the bullet stream would intersect with the true flight path. To prove it, instructors built rotating mock turrets, optical simulators, and even film projections where trainees could practice on moving images of enemy fighters. They noticed something extraordinary. Once students started adjusting their aim backward, their hit rates doubled within hours. This insight spread through test ranges like wildfire. Reports were sent to Wright Field, headquarters of U.S. Army Air Force's research. Engineers began integrating the principle into gunnery manuals and computing sites. It became part of the training syllabus under a new name: lag pursuit. By late 1943, gunners shipping out to England were being quietly briefed on this strange new technique. Few believed it until they saw it in combat. For the first time, science had stepped directly into the gunner's turret, and what it revealed would soon turn the tide of the air war over Europe. The human angle inside a bomber. There was no glory, only cold, noise, and fear. For the men who served as gunners, every mission meant climbing into a metal shell barely larger than a coffin, surrounded by glass and guns, thousands of feet above enemy territory. Sergeant James "Red" Miller, a waist gunner with the 303rd Bomb Group, later described the feeling as like fighting a war from inside a refrigerator that's being shaken to pieces. Oxygen froze inside masks, fingers went numb even through thick gloves, and the constant vibration turned minutes into hours. Yet, amid that discomfort, every gunner carried the same responsibility: defend 10 lives with a few seconds of accuracy. The pressure was immense. They were trained to fire in short bursts, conserve ammo, and coordinate with other gunners to form a wall of fire. But during combat, coordination vanished. The sky was chaos, twisting contrails, burning aircraft, and the blur of fighters flashing by at 400 miles per hour. For many, the worst part wasn't fear. It was helplessness. They saw the enemy, they fired, but nothing hit. Mission after mission, they returned home with empty belts and no confirmed kills. Then came the guilt. The bomber behind them was gone. The men they'd eaten breakfast with vanished in a flash of fire. And in the debrief room, instructors would ask the same question: where did you aim? Every answer was identical. Right at him. When the new directive arrived, aim behind the target. Most crews laughed. It sounded like a cruel joke. Even seasoned instructors hesitated to teach it. To deliberately fire where the enemy wasn't felt like surrendering to insanity. But desperation changed minds. The losses had to stop. And when the first training sessions began, disbelief slowly gave way to astonishment. At gunnery ranges in England, airmen practiced with towed targets and film simulators. When they applied the lag pursuit correction, their tracers began striking home. For the first time, the sound of the guns was followed by a sight few gunners ever saw, a clean hit when Sargent later said it felt like learning that gravity had been lying to you all. Along, the shift wasn't just technical, it was emotional. Gunners who once felt powerless now carried a new kind of confidence into the air. They weren't just reacting anymore, they understood why they'd been missing. Every mission became a test not only of skill, but of trust. Trust in mathematics, in physics, and in the quiet men on the ground who'd proven what instinct could not. The next time the Luftwaffe came, the gunners of the 8th Air Force were ready. Steady hands, calm hearts, and eyes trained to see the sky differently. The technological angle what made the aim behind revelation so powerful wasn't just the theory. It was how precisely the U.S. Army Air Forces turned it into practice. By 1943, America's scientific machine was in full motion, connecting laboratories, flight schools, and battlefronts in a web of wartime innovation. The gunnery problem became a case study in merging technology with human perception. At Wright Field in Ohio, engineers began analyzing combat footage from gun cameras mounted on returning bombers. Each reel showed the same frustration. Perfectly centered tracers, perfectly clean misses. But when frame-by-frame analysis overlaid bullet trajectories with the fighter's actual motion, the invisible truth emerged. The error angle, sometimes only 3 or 4 degrees, meant the difference between life and death. To fix it, scientists broke down the geometry of pursuit. They defined 2 essential principles: lead pursuit, aiming ahead of the target, and lag pursuit, aiming behind. In fast-closing attacks, lag pursuit compensated for the visual delay and high relative speed. When applied correctly, bullets didn't chase the target. They met it. From this revelation came a wave of training innovation. At the Army Air Force's Gunnery School in Harlingen, Texas, instructors introduced moving light targets projected on screens, while camera guns recorded the students' aim points. On desert ranges, real aircraft towed canvas sleeves at over 200 millipers, allowing trainees to fire live rounds and later analyze their hits. But the most effective tool of all was the synthetic gunnery trainer, a mechanical dome filled with projected film of attacking fighters. The student sat inside a realistic turret replica, tracking on-screen aircraft through a gun sight while a camera captured his reactions. The films were based on real Luftwaffe maneuvers, head-on dives, corkscrew attacks, low-level rolls. When instructors replayed the footage in slow motion, the proof was undeniable. The students who aimed behind consistently achieved the most hits. The U.S. military now had data, and that changed everything. Within months, field manuals were rewritten. Illustrations showed sight pictures with the enemy not centered, but slightly ahead of the tracers. Bomb groups received pamphlets titled Aerial Gunnery, The Science of Deflection, and engineers began adjusting gun sights, such as the famous Sperry K3, to better align with the new lag pursuit principles. Even the Norden bomb sight engineers took notice, realizing that visual compensation for motion and parallax applied to both bombing and gunnery. Combat was now as much a matter of computation as courage. When the 8th Air Force began retraining entire crews under the new system, skeptics disappeared. The difference on film, and soon in combat reports, was too clear to deny. In a war defined by technology, radar, code-breaking, jet engines, this quiet discovery stood apart. It required no new weapon, no new invention, only a new way of seeing. And when those new eyes took to the skies over Europe, the results would shock even the men who'd written the equations. By the winter of 1943, the 8th Air Force was preparing for another deep strike into Germany. The targets, the industrial heartlands of Bremen and Schweinfurt, names already carved into the memories of every aircrewman for their deadly flak and fighter resistance. But this time, something was different. In quiet briefings at airfields across England, Bassingbourn, Kimbolton, Thorpe Abbotts, the gunnery officers gave a new instruction. It wasn't shouted or even emphasized, just a calm reminder as the men gathered around diagrams of German attack patterns. Remember, lag your shot. To many gunners, it still sounded strange. Old habits don't vanish easily. Yet in the freezing gray dawn of December 20th, 1943, as B-17s and B-24s crossed the Dutch coast, those 4 words would finally prove their worth. At 24,000 feet, the formation came under attack. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 110s roared in from the sun, guns flashing, cannons thundering. The bombers tightened their boxes, and the turrets came alive. Tracers filled the air, red and white streaks against the sky. This time, something remarkable happened. Tail gunners, who once watched their bullets sail harmlessly ahead, now saw them connect, tearing through enemy wings and cockpits. Luftwaffe fighters broke formation, some plunging into clouds trailing smoke. Over the intercom, disbelief turned to stunned laughter and cheers. After the mission, the debriefing officers recorded the results. Enemy aircraft claims had nearly doubled compared to previous missions of similar scale. Camera gun footage confirmed it. Hits were cleaner, patterns tighter, accuracy far higher. What had changed wasn't the weapon. It was perception. The act of aiming behind had reversed years of instinct and, in doing so, rewired aerial combat itself. In the bitter air over Bremen and Schweinfurt, American gunners finally understood that their bullets didn't chase. They predicted. And for the Luftwaffe, the skies over Europe were no longer theirs alone. When the data came in from those December raids, the transformation was impossible to ignore. Across multiple bomb groups, the 91st, the 303rd, the 100th, and others, mission analysts noted a sudden, sharp increase in confirmed kills and damaged enemy aircraft. Gun camera films that once showed near misses now captured precise, lethal strikes. The shift was so consistent that headquarters in High Wycombe ordered an investigation. The findings, compiled in early January 1944, confirmed it beyond doubt. Gunners trained under the new lag pursuit doctrine were achieving twice the hit probability of those still using the traditional lead method. The evidence rippled through the chain of command. Brigadier General Robert Travis, head of bomber training operations in England, sent an urgent dispatch to stateside schools. Immediate integration of the Eglin Field Correction into all future gunnery training. Results verified by operational data. In plain terms, a single change in aim point had begun saving hundreds of lives per month. For the crews, the difference was more than statistical. In combat, they could feel it. The hesitation was gone. Where once they had fired in hope, now they fired with confidence. The sky no longer felt one-sided. German pilots noticed it too. The once predictable defensive fire now met them with uncanny precision. Luftwaffe ace reports from 1944 mention heavier and more accurate return fire from American formations, a sign that the hunters had begun turning into hunted. Even gunners, who didn't know the science behind the change, sensed its power. Staff Sergeant Harold Klein of the 390th Bomb Group later said, It was like someone finally turned the lights on in the sky. You started to trust the tracers again. The results fed directly into the U.S. Air Force's tactical evolution. By spring 1944, bomber escort formations, fighter engagements, and turret design all began incorporating predictive targeting calculations. The logic of lag pursuit became the backbone of American aerial combat doctrine. A simple act, aiming behind the enemy, had done more than double kill rates. It had restored balance to the air war. But victory in the skies always came with a price. And as the months went on, that price would become painfully clear in the aftermath that followed. By early 1944, the results of the new gunnery doctrine were written not just in reports, but in survival rates. For the first time since the bombing campaign over Europe had begun, the numbers started to bend in America's favor. Missions that once saw a third of the bombers lost were now returning with most of their crews intact. The statistics told the story clearly. Where gunners had been trained to aim behind, the hit probability had more than doubled, and the average number of German fighters destroyed per mission rose dramatically. In practical terms, it meant fewer German attacks pressed home, fewer bombers destroyed, and thousands of airmen who lived to see another dawn. Commanders quickly recognized that this wasn't a minor correction. It was a revolution. The Air Force's Tactical Evaluation Board concluded that the lag pursuit method had reduced overall combat losses by nearly 20% within the first 6 months of widespread adoption. For a force flying thousands of sorties per month, that was a transformation of staggering scale. And with every successful mission, the confidence of the bomber crews grew. No longer did they feel like helpless targets drifting through enemy skies. Their defensive firepower, once inconsistent and desperate, now felt precise, scientific, almost predictive. In debriefings, gunners spoke of how the Germans seemed less fearless and more cautious. The Luftwaffe's legendary head-on attacks began to falter as pilots learned that a mistake in timing now meant death. This new American accuracy forced the Luftwaffe to adapt. German commanders ordered their pilots to alter attack angles, shifting from rear and frontal approaches to high-speed slashing attacks from the sides. Tactics designed to minimize exposure to the bombers' more lethal defensive arcs. But even then, the tide had turned. By mid-1944, with Allied long-range escorts like the P-51 Mustang joining formations, the Luftwaffe found itself overwhelmed both by technology and precision. For the first time since 1940, the airspace over Germany no longer belonged to the Reich. The hunters had become the hunted, and much of that shift began with one subtle adjustment. A fraction of a second, a few degrees of deflection, and a radical new way to see the sky. The full impact of the aim-behind principle extended far beyond the bomber formations of 1944. What began as a desperate correction in aerial gunnery soon evolved into a cornerstone of modern targeting. Science influencing everything from radar-guided weapons to computer-assisted fire control systems. After the war, analysts at Wright Field compiled a massive report titled Evaluation of Air Combat Gunnery Techniques, 1943 to 1945. Its conclusion was simple but profound. Human perception alone could not be trusted in high-speed warfare. The future of combat would belong to computation, to machines that could see, calculate, and predict faster than any man. That idea became the seed for post-war research into lead computing gun sights and electromechanical predictors. Devices like the K-14 gyro gun sight, first tested in late 1944, were direct descendants of the lag pursuit philosophy. Instead of asking pilots to guess where to aim, these sights automatically calculated the correct deflection, effectively aiming behind for them. The British Royal Air Force and the Soviet Air Force both took notice. In Britain, the Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford adapted similar principles into gunnery simulators for the new generation of jet fighters. In the Soviet Union, Yakovlev test pilots integrated motion-based lead corrections into their training doctrine, later mirrored in MiG development. The idea spread even further. When the U.S. Navy began designing radar-directed fire control for warships, the same predictive algorithms were used to account for the movement of enemy aircraft and ships, all descendants of that first insight born from the cold, chaotic skies over Germany. Yet the legacy wasn't only technical. For the gunners who survived those missions, the change meant something deeply human. It proved that survival in war sometimes depended not on bravery or instinct, but on humility, on the willingness to admit that even the eye can lie. By the war's end, the 8th Air Force had lost over 26,000 men. But without that small, counterintuitive correction, the number could have been far higher. In the end, the lesson was simple. Seeing the truth often means looking where logic tells you not to. And for those who fought in the frozen air above Europe, that truth had been written one bullet at a time, in the empty sky behind the enemy. In war, the difference between life and death often comes down to perception, to how clearly one can see through chaos. For the U.S. gunners of World War II, that clarity didn't come from instinct or courage alone. It came from the moment they realized that their eyes were deceiving them, that the truth of survival lay not ahead of the enemy, but behind him. The lesson was quiet, almost philosophical. Sometimes the human mind must unlearn what feels natural to discover what is true. The act of aiming behind a target was more than a tactical adjustment. It was a profound acknowledgement of the limits of human perception in a world moving too fast for intuition to keep up. What began as a desperate fix for missed shots became a revelation that rippled through generations of warfare. From bomber turrets to jet cockpits, from mechanical sights to computer algorithms, the concept of predictive targeting, of seeing where the enemy will be rather than where he is, became the foundation of modern combat systems. But beyond the technology lies a deeper story, one of adaptation, humility, and trust. Trust in science over instinct. Trust in the unseen math that guided invisible lines through the sky. And trust in the nameless instructors and researchers who, working far from the front, quietly changed the fate of thousands of airmen. Today, the names of those gunners are largely forgotten. Their turrets sit silent in museums, their missions recorded only in faded logbooks. But their discovery endures. In every modern targeting computer, every radar lock, every missile that calculates its path before it flies, all of it began with a single, almost illogical realization: to strike the enemy, you must not chase him. You must understand him, his motion, his speed, his future. And that truth, born from the frozen skies of 1943, remains the invisible equation behind every shot ever fired since.